Welcome and settle in. Tonight, we travel to the pine woods of East Texas, where a quiet winter drive became one of the most mysterious encounters in modern history. It is a story that begins with ordinary people on an ordinary road and unfolds into a moment so strange that it has remained unexplained for more than 4 decades. This is the story of Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum, and young Colby, 3 travelers on a December night, bound together by family ties and simple routine. They were not looking for mysteries. They were not searching the sky. Yet on this journey, the sky came searching for them. So let the noise of the day fall away. Let your breath grow steady, your body soft against the bed. With each word, drift further into stillness, and let us step carefully onto a Texas highway where headlights cut the dark, where pines sway gently in the evening wind, and where silence held something far stranger than silence alone. It was December 29th, 1980. The air in East Texas was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. Christmas had just passed, and holiday lights still glowed faintly in windows of farmhouses scattered along the road. The season held both cheer and quiet. For Betty, Vickie, and 7-year-old Colby, the night was nothing unusual. Just a drive home, miles of forest and blacktop unfolding beneath the glow of their headlights. Inside the car, the warmth of family carried them forward. Conversation flickered between everyday topics: what they'd eaten for dinner, the errands left unfinished, the gentle complaints of a child kept up past bedtime. The kind of talk that softens the edge of long country roads. Outside, cicadas gave their final calls of the season, their drone fading into the winter dusk. Above, the stars were just beginning to emerge, scattered across the wide Texas sky. Yet as they drove deeper into the forested stretch, the world seemed to grow unusually still. The hum of the tires, the faint crackle of the heater, the rhythmic sweep of the headlights across the pines, all of it seemed sharper, louder, as though something vast and unseen pressed down from above. The road stretched on, a ribbon of darkness between towering trees, each mile carrying them further into quiet mystery. Then came the first hint of something unusual. At first it was no more than a glow, a flicker in the distance, pale and strange, far brighter than headlights or farmhouse lanterns. It pulsed faintly through the branches ahead, a light that did not belong to the familiar world of Texas highways. None of them could have known that this glow would change everything, that in the minutes ahead, they would face something no human eyes were meant to see up close. A craft like no plane, no helicopter, no machine known to man. Heat, light, and fire in the winter woods, in an encounter that would leave not just memory, but scars. The story of what followed would ripple through hospitals, courtrooms, military offices, and decades of debate. But in this moment, it was only 3 people on a darkened road, leaning forward in their seats, eyes fixed on an impossible light. And so begins the Cash Landrum Incident. A night of fire in the sky, of helicopters in the dark, and of silence that followed louder than any words. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Diamond in the Sky. The 2-lane road wound quietly through the East Texas woods. It was the kind of highway that seemed endless at night, its painted lines swallowed by the dark, its shoulders fading into shadows of tall pines and underbrush. Betty Cash kept her eyes steady on the blacktop ahead. Her hands rested firm on the wheel, the car humming steadily beneath her. Beside her sat Vickie Landrum, and in the back seat, 7-year-old Colby leaned against the glass, watching faint shapes of trees pass in the glow of the headlights. The evening had begun without incident. A visit, a shared meal, the warmth of family during the holidays. In 1980, these drives were ordinary. Life in the region followed familiar rhythms: small towns, church gatherings, family dinners. For Betty and Vickie, the road home was a matter of habit, a stretch they had driven countless times before. The car's heater kept the chill at bay, carrying the faint scent of pine resin that clung to the winter air. Inside, conversation was soft, steady, and reassuring. Betty and Vickie spoke of the little things: groceries to pick up later in the week, the cost of gas, how Colby was growing faster than either of them could quite keep up with. Vickie reached back now and then, patting her grandson's knee, reminding him to sit back, to rest his eyes. Colby murmured protests in the drowsy way children do, insisting he wasn't tired even as his voice betrayed him. The car itself was a kind of cocoon against the night. Its headlights stretched into the darkness, painting the road with pale beams that caught the reflective stripes of signs and the sudden gleam of animal eyes at the forest's edge. The world outside felt vast, but inside there was the comfort of togetherness, of being known and understood. Betty, practical and steady. Vickie, firm in her faith, always protective of the boy beside her. And Colby, innocent and curious, unaware that the night held anything more than another long drive through the woods. Now and then, a farmhouse appeared in the distance. Its windows glowed with the last of Christmas decorations, colored bulbs strung along porches, plastic reindeer resting in yards. The season still lingered, giving the countryside a faint shimmer of festivity even in the quiet. Betty noticed them in passing, but kept her focus forward. The road demanded attention. Deer sometimes darted across the highway. Trucks rumbled through the region, their drivers pushing long hours between towns. The silence between conversations felt easy, punctuated by the rhythmic sound of tires on pavement, the low murmur of the engine, the faint hiss of the heater's fan. It was a soundtrack as familiar as breathing. Nothing at that moment suggested the extraordinary, yet if one listened closely, there was an undertone to the night, the kind of hush that made the woods feel taller, the sky wider, the road more remote than it had in daylight. For those attuned to the quiet, it was as though the world held its breath, waiting. Betty did not notice it consciously, though later she would remember how unusually still the forest had seemed. Colby, pressed against the glass, blinked at the stars emerging above the tree line. To him they looked sharper than usual, more numerous, as though the sky had gathered its lights in anticipation. For now, though, they were simply a family on a Texas highway, miles from home but untroubled. The hum of the car, the glow of headlights, the comfort of routine, these were the anchors of their night. Whatever lay ahead remained hidden, just around the bend, beyond the trees, waiting to step into their world. The first half of the journey was nearly over. They did not yet know that the second half would mark them forever. The road bent slowly to the left, cutting deeper into the trees. Ahead, the horizon glowed faintly, but it was not the glow of town lights or oncoming headlights. At first it was only a shimmer, a pulse of brightness that seemed too high, too steady to be anything ordinary. Betty squinted, her hands tightening on the wheel. "Do you see that?" she asked quietly, her voice more curious than alarmed. Vickie leaned forward, peering through the windshield. Colby, roused from his near-drowsing state, sat upright in the back seat. The glow pulsed again, this time brighter, sharper, as if some hidden flame had licked across the sky. At first, Betty thought it might be an aircraft, maybe a plane in trouble. The region was dotted with military bases and testing ranges. Strange lights were not unheard of, but usually they streaked quickly, vanished, or revealed themselves as ordinary jets banking in the distance. This was different. Through the branches of the pines, A shape began to emerge, not round like the moon, not a straight beam like headlights. It was angular, diamond-like, its edges glinting with a metallic sheen, as though it reflected not just its own fire, but the faint starlight around it. The car slowed almost without Betty realizing. Her foot eased off the accelerator as her eyes fixed on the sky. Vickie murmured a prayer under her breath, one hand reaching instinctively to rest on Colby's shoulder. The boy's wide eyes reflected the light as the object hovered closer. The craft pulsed again, releasing a radiance that spilled across the treetops. Shadows stretched across the road, long and sharp, shifting with each beat of the light. The pines glowed faintly, their needles catching the brightness in fleeting flashes. The air itself seemed to shimmer, as if heat waves were rising from asphalt, even though the night was cool. Betty slowed to a near stop. The diamond shape now filled the sky ahead, massive and deliberate. It was not racing past like a shooting star or distant jet. It was holding its position, tilting slightly, as though adjusting its balance. The light it gave off was unlike anything they had seen before. It was not the steady beam of a searchlight or the flicker of a fire. It was alive, beating like a heart, growing and fading, each pulse resonating through the night. Vickie whispered sharply, "It's not right." Her voice trembled, but her eyes stayed locked on the object. Colby leaned forward between the seats, his small hands gripping the edge of the upholstery, his breath shallow. Betty, though deeply unsettled, felt her gaze pulled to the brilliance. The craft was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. Its diamond shape gleamed against the night sky, its lower half glowing as though alive with molten fire. For a moment she felt rooted, unable to look away, caught between awe and fear. The world around them seemed to fall into silence. The hum of the car, the faint rattle of loose objects in the glove box, even the usual chorus of crickets and cicadas, all seemed muted, absorbed by the glow. The road ahead no longer felt like an ordinary stretch of East Texas blacktop. It felt like a stage set for something far larger, far stranger. The craft hovered there, suspended above the pines, its presence undeniable. Every instinct said stop, every instinct said turn back, but something deeper urged them forward, as if the night had chosen them to witness. The first glimpse had become a revelation. What had been a quiet drive was now a threshold. Beyond it, their world would never look the same again. The glow ahead grew too bright to ignore. Betty eased the car onto the narrow shoulder, the tires crunching against gravel. For a moment she simply sat, her hands gripping the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the sky. The object loomed above the pines, pulsing with a heat that seemed to ripple through the windshield. The three of them sat in silence. Even Colby, usually restless on long drives, was still, his face pale in the shifting light. Vickie reached out and touched Betty's arm. "Maybe we shouldn't stop," she whispered, but the words carried little weight. Curiosity, or perhaps something stronger, held them all. The heater clicked off as Betty turned the ignition key halfway back. The hum of the engine faded. What replaced it was stranger, a faint, low vibration that seemed to come from the sky itself. It wasn't loud, not like an airplane. It was a resonance, a thrum that pressed into their chests and tingled at the edge of their skin. Betty opened her door slowly. The cold night air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the faint bite of smoke. She stepped onto the shoulder of the road, her breath turning white in the cool air. Above, the diamond-shaped craft hovered with deliberate grace, tilting as though it balanced on invisible currents. Vickie followed reluctantly, pulling Colby close against her side. She draped an arm over his shoulders, shielding him with the instinct of a grandmother, her faith and fear entwined. Colby clung to her, his small hands gripping tightly, but his eyes never left the glow above. The three stood in the hush of the forest road, the headlights still burning weakly against the pines, but drowned by the radiance overhead. Shadows shifted with each pulse of light, stretching and recoiling across the ground like living things. The air felt hotter now, dry against their faces, as if a furnace door had opened somewhere above them. Betty took a few steps forward, her eyes wide. She had seen aircraft before, military planes from bases across Texas, even helicopters in training flights. This was nothing like them. Its movement was heavy yet precise, not gliding but deliberately suspending itself in place. The flames that pulsed beneath it did not roar or crackle, but shimmered like controlled bursts, waves of heat dancing across the branches. For a moment, awe washed over her, a sense that she was witnessing something beyond explanation, something extraordinary. Then came the fear. The heat prickled against her skin, sharp and growing stronger. Her heart pounded as the thought sank in. Whatever this was, it was close. Behind her, Vickie whispered prayers, words tumbling under her breath, half shield, half plea. She tightened her hold on Colby, who buried his face briefly against her coat before peeking out once more, drawn to the strange light despite his fear. The highway was empty, no other cars passing, no witnesses but the three of them. The pines stretched high and silent, their needles glowing faintly in the shimmering waves of heat. The craft hung there like a suspended jewel, a diamond set in the vast crown of the night sky. Betty lifted her hand as if to steady herself, though there was nothing to hold. The radiance poured over her, dazzling and suffocating all at once. She would never forget this moment, the awe, the heat, the impossible presence of a machine that should not exist, hanging above an ordinary Texas road. What began as a winter drive had become something else entirely, and the night was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Fire in the Darkness. The stillness broke not with sound, but with sensation. A wave of heat spilled down from the hovering diamond, washing over the road, the trees, and the three figures standing on the shoulder. It was not the crisp warmth of a campfire or the dry heat of the Texas sun. This was something different. It pressed into their skin like invisible hands, sharp and insistent, prickling every exposed surface. Betty drew in a startled breath. The air around her felt thick, weighted, as though she were standing too close to an open oven. She lifted her hand to shield her face, but the light pressed through her fingers, casting shadows across her cheeks. Vickie pulled Colby closer, wrapping her arm protectively around his small frame. "Stay back," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. She tried to guide him behind her, her own body a barrier between the boy and the radiance. Colby didn't resist. His wide eyes blinked against the brightness, his face turned away from the direct glare. The craft pulsed again, and with each pulse came another shimmer of heat. The branches of the pines bent subtly, as if a strong summer wind had passed through, though the air was still. The smell of warmed resin drifted down from the treetops, mingling with something harsher, a metallic tang that stung the back of the throat. Betty took another step forward, unable to resist the pull of the sight. She felt both awe and dread tangled together, an overwhelming sense that this was a moment outside the boundaries of ordinary life. she whispered softly, almost to herself. "It's beautiful, but beauty carried a price." The warmth deepened into discomfort, then into something sharper. Betty's skin tingled, reddening as though she were standing beneath a relentless summer sun. She did not step back. Her gaze stayed locked on the glowing diamond, her breath shallow, her mind caught in a struggle between fascination and fear. Vickie's prayers grew louder now, the rhythm of them steady, almost chanting. Each word was half a shield, half a plea. She believed firmly in faith's protection, but the sight before her was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was not heaven's light she saw. It was something unknown, unclaimed by any scripture she had studied. The ground beneath them shimmered faintly, small waves of heat rising from the asphalt. Betty's car, parked just a few feet away, clicked as its metal frame expanded, the hood reflecting the glow like a mirror. Inside the cabin, the vinyl seats and dashboard began to grow hot, as though the vehicle itself were sitting under a midday sun rather than a winter night. Colby whimpered, burying his face against Vickie's coat. His small body trembled, sensing the danger even if he could not name it. Vickie pressed her lips against the top of his head, whispering promises that they would be safe, though even she did not know if they were true. Another pulse of fire glowed from beneath the craft. The flames were not wild or uncontrolled. They seemed deliberate, measured, as though the machine was expelling energy in a rhythm all its own. The pines lit up in orange flickers, their trunks glowing briefly before fading back into shadow. The air grew hotter, sharper, carrying with it the faint crackle of something unseen. Betty raised her hand to her cheek, her skin hot to the touch. She finally stepped back, her body protesting what her curiosity had demanded. The night no longer felt still, it felt alive, charged with energy that was both dazzling and dangerous. On that empty Texas highway, the world had changed. Heat, light, and silence pressed down in equal measure, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. The craft above pulsed once more, a diamond of fire in the darkness, its presence undeniable and inescapable. The glow from the hovering craft deepened, its pulsing fire throwing waves of light across the pines. Each flare seemed to paint the forest in shifting tones, one moment orange, the next white hot, then dimming to a dull red before swelling again. It was as if the sky itself was breathing, each exhalation radiating heat. Vickie clutched Colby tightly against her, her body forming a shield. She crouched slightly, angling herself so that the boy's small face was buried in her shoulder. "Don't look, baby," she whispered, rocking him gently, as though they were safe at home, not standing beneath something that felt as though it could unmake the night. Colby whimpered, his arms clinging to her neck. The boy's world had always been ordinary. School days, church services, quiet visits to his grandmother's house. Now faced with the impossible, he sought only the safety of her embrace. His heartbeat drummed against her chest, fast and uneven, but just a few feet away, Betty Cash could not look away. Where Vickie's instinct was to shield, Betty's was to confront, to see. Her eyes stayed fixed on the diamond-shaped craft, drinking in its every detail. The light reflected in her pupils, her expression caught between awe and disbelief. She whispered softly, almost reverently, "It's not from here." The flames beneath the object surged again, bright enough that Betty had to lift a hand against the brilliance. Heat pressed into her skin, sharper now, prickling like invisible sparks. She knew she should retreat, that the danger was real, but something in the sight held her fast, a gravity stronger than fear. Vickie glanced at her sharply, her voice rising above the hum of the craft. "Betty, come back. Get away from it." Her words cracked with urgency, with the terror of a woman certain that harm was moments away. But Betty did not move. The air shimmered around them, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The pine branches nearest the road swayed gently, though no wind touched them. The smell of heated resin mixed with something harsher, metallic and biting, catching at the back of the throat. Vickie turned her face toward the sky for just a moment, her grip on Colby unyielding. She saw Betty silhouetted in the light, her figure small against the looming craft, as if she were being drawn into its orbit without taking a single step. Fear welled in Vickie's chest. She prayed louder now, words spilling urgently, fragments of scripture and pleading. Her faith was her anchor, the one thing she felt could stand against whatever force had come down upon them. She pressed her cheek against Colby's hair and closed her eyes, willing the moment to pass, willing the sky to release them. Betty, though, remained transfixed. She could see the craft tilting slightly, deliberate, steady, as though it were alive. Its presence was heavy, commanding, unlike anything human built. The pulsing radiance fascinated her, not just its light, but the sheer impossibility of it hovering there in defiance of every law she knew. Her skin burned, red patches blooming across her arms and face. She winced at the pain, but did not step back. Something inside her insisted she look, that she remember, that she hold the image in her mind, no matter the cost. The three of them, standing so close together, were divided by their responses. A grandmother shielding her grandson with the fierce strength of love, a child clinging to her side, trembling in the presence of the unknown, and a woman, captivated, unable to retreat from a vision that defied comprehension. The night pressed in around them, silent but for the hum of the craft and the rustle of pine needles in the heat. Every moment stretched long, suspended, as though time itself had slowed to match the hovering diamond above. The hovering diamond shifted. It did not bank like a plane, nor tilt like a helicopter easing into position. Instead, its entire body seemed to pivot on an invisible axis, a deliberate adjustment that was too smooth, too exact. The flames beneath it flared, then contracted, like bellows drawing breath. Betty watched, entranced. Each movement was purposeful, as if the craft weighed more than any known machine, yet carried itself with a precision that defied its bulk. It did not drift. It did not falter. It moved as though guided by intelligence beyond the limits of human engineering. A low vibration pulsed through the ground, subtle but steady, reaching through the soles of their shoes into their bones. The asphalt shimmered faintly, heat waves rising in undulating ribbons. The car parked behind them groaned softly as its metal expanded, the windshield glass fogging at the edges. Vickie tightened her arms around Colby. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered, though the words felt too small for the enormity of what towered above them. She pulled him closer, urging him toward the car, but the boy's eyes were wide, caught between fear and a child's raw curiosity. The craft tilted again, this time toward the roadway. Its diamond-shaped form cast shifting shadows across the pines, stretching them into long, jagged silhouettes. For a moment, it seemed almost alive, not just a machine, but a presence, aware of the three figures below. Betty felt her chest tighten, the heat pressing harder now. She coughed, her throat raw with the metallic taste that lingered in the air. Yet still she held her gaze. "It's watching us," she murmured, not knowing if the words were true or if they were only the echo of her racing thoughts. The flames beneath the object shifted again, not wild, but measured. Each burst illuminated the undercarriage, revealing struts and panels that gleamed like polished metal, smooth and seamless. No rivets, no seams, nothing familiar, only perfection, as though it had been carved from a single piece of impossible alloy. Vickie urged Colby back toward the car, shielding him with her body. She kept her head bowed, unable to endure the radiance. "Come away, Betty," she pleaded, her voice strained. But Betty stood firm, her skin flushed, her eyes fixed upward, as though she believed if she looked away, the truth of what she saw might vanish. The craft began to rise, slowly, heavily, as if gathering strength. Its ascent was not graceful like a bird's, nor forceful like a rocket's. It was controlled, deliberate, each movement exact. The flames flared bright, heat radiating outward in stronger waves. The treetops glowed, and then darkened again, their needles rustling in response to forces they could not resist. For a moment, the craft hovered higher, then tilted sharply, angling toward the stretch of road ahead. Its precision was unnerving, not the mechanical adjustment of a human pilot, but something instinctive, automatic, almost sentient. Then, just as suddenly, it steadied, hovering once more, as though undecided. The silence pressed in again, broken only by the hum that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. In that silence, Betty, Vickie, and Colby understood that they were in the presence of something far beyond them, not merely unusual, not merely strange, but impossible. A machine that should not exist, moving with purpose in the Texas night. The awe that had drawn Betty forward now curdled into dread, for if it could move with such impossible control, what else might it be capable of? Chapter 3. The military response. The craft lingered, pulsing above the trees, its radiance painting the night in shifting tones of orange and white. Betty squinted against the brilliance, her skin hot, her breath uneven. Vickie clutched Colby close, whispering prayers into his hair. The world around them seemed to exist only in the circle of light cast down from the diamond in the sky. Then, faint at first, came another sound. It was distant, a low murmur hidden beneath the hum of the craft. At first, Betty thought it might be the wind finally returning to the pines, but the air was still. Vickie lifted her head, frowning, her ears straining. The sound swelled slowly, a rhythmic thumping that grew clearer with each passing second. "Do you hear that?" Betty whispered. Vickie nodded, her eyes narrowing as she turned toward the dark horizon. Colby stirred, lifting his head from her shoulder. His eyes widened as the noise grew louder, a heavy, mechanical beat that pressed against the silence of the forest. It was the unmistakable rhythm of rotor blades, dozens of them. The noise expanded, rolling across the treetops like distant thunder. It came from more than one direction, a layered percussion that suggested not a lone helicopter, but a fleet. The pines shivered under the vibration, their needles trembling as if the forest itself had grown uneasy. Betty stepped forward instinctively, searching the sky. "They're coming," she murmured, though she wasn't sure whether the words carried relief or dread. Within moments, the first shapes appeared, dark silhouettes, their blades slicing the night air, emerged against the faint light of the stars. One, then another, then another. A formation of helicopters sweeping into view, their paths converging toward the glowing diamond. The roar of their engines filled the night, overwhelming the hum of the craft, drowning the quiet of the woods. The empty road trembled, loose gravel rattling beneath the parked car's tires. Colby pressed his hands over his ears, his face tightening at the noise. Vickie held him close, whispering assurances he could barely hear above the thunder. The helicopters moved in unison, circling the craft as though on command. Their navigation lights blinked red and green, flashing against the pale brilliance that radiated from the object. The contrast was surreal, familiar military machines orbiting something that no human pilot should have been able to fly. Betty's heart pounded. If the helicopters were here, then someone knew, someone expected this. The sight should have reassured her, but instead it deepened her unease. Why were they not engaging directly? Why did they only circle, as though escorting? The craft pulsed again, brighter than before, and the helicopters adjusted, their formations tightening. The blades carved the air in overlapping rhythms, their engines growling like a mechanical chorus. Yet none drew close enough to touch. They held a distance, watching, surrounding, but never intervening. Vickie's grip on Colby tightened. She looked from the hovering craft to the circling helicopters, her voice low, urgent. They know about it. They've always known. The thought pressed cold into Betty's mind. These weren't chance witnesses like the three of them. The military presence suggested coordination, knowledge, secrecy. Whatever hovered above the Texas pines was not unknown to everyone. The sky was no longer silent. It was alive with engines, with light, with movements that clashed, human and unearthly, side by side. The family stood on the roadside, small and powerless, beneath the roaring display, as the night revealed a truth they could never have imagined. And the helicopters kept coming. The roar grew until it seemed the very forest shook. Rotor blades beat the night air with relentless rhythm, each thump reverberating through the pines and down into the asphalt beneath Betty's shoes. The once silent stretch of highway now trembled with the thunder of engines. Above the treetops, black silhouettes multiplied. Helicopters, dozens of them, swept into formation around the blazing diamond. Their navigation lights winked in measured intervals, red and green, as though choreographed to an unseen command. Against the brilliance of the craft, their outlines looked fragile, almost insubstantial, like moths circling a fire. Betty shaded her eyes with one hand, squinting through the radiance. The sight was surreal. Military hardware, precise and familiar, orbiting something utterly alien. The helicopters moved with discipline, banking smoothly, their searchlights dark. None attempted to land. None tried to draw closer. It was as if their sole task was to contain the impossible in the night sky. Vickie clutched Colby tighter, bending down to press his head against her chest. His small hands still clamped over his ears, muffling the roar. "It's too much," she whispered. "Lord, it's too much." Her words trembled, half prayer, half plea. Betty felt her skin burn, with the heat still spilling from the craft. The helicopters offered no comfort. Their presence raised more questions than they answered. If this was a military operation, why bring civilians so close to harm? If it wasn't, why did the military already know where to be? The diamond tilted again, a slow, deliberate motion, as if acknowledging the circle of machines around it. Its flames pulsed brighter, and a fresh wave of heat rippled across the forest. The pine branches nearest the road shimmered, needles curling faintly in the dry air. Betty could feel it tightening across her skin, hot enough now that she instinctively stepped back, though her eyes never left the craft. The helicopters adjusted in unison, keeping their distance but tightening their circle. Their rotors cut through the glowing haze, stirring the night with overlapping currents. The rhythm of their blades merged into a single overwhelming roar, a wall of sound that made the ground vibrate. Colby peeked briefly from Vickie's shoulder, his young face caught in the strobe of flashing lights. He stared upward, eyes wide in wonder and fear, before pressing back into her embrace. She rocked him gently, whispering words of comfort he could not fully hear. For Betty, the moment carved itself into her memory. A fleet of helicopters, so many she could not count them all, orbiting something that should not exist. The air reeked of hot metal and resin, the sky glared with impossible fire, and all around them was the steady circle of machines serving a purpose no one explained. Her thoughts whirled. Were they escorting it, herding it, protecting it from sight? She could not decide which answer chilled her more. The craft shifted once more, edging forward down the line of the highway, its flames glowing steady, controlled. The helicopters mirrored its movement perfectly, circling, adjusting, never leaving its side, like guardians, like prisoners, like shadows bound to a source of light. Betty whispered, almost without realizing, "They know what it is." The words slipped out, barely audible beneath the thunder of the blades. Vickie's eyes met hers briefly, filled with fear and certainty. She didn't argue. She only held Colby closer, the boy trembling in her arms. The formation continued, sweeping across the forested stretch of highway with mechanical grace. The ordinary world, the pine woods, the dark road, the parked car, felt insignificant now, swallowed in the spectacle above. The family stood as witnesses on the roadside, three small figures beneath the roaring sky, watching as the night revealed a secret too vast to be contained. The forest road had become a stage. Above it, the impossible diamond blazed, flames shimmering beneath its massive frame. Encircling it, like a black crown of steel, dozens of helicopters traced their steady arcs. Their blades cut the air with deafening rhythm, a sound so vast it seemed to press down on the earth itself. Betty stood transfixed, her eyes darting between the glowing craft and the circling machines. Her mind struggled to piece together the scene. If this was unknown, something truly alien, why were military aircraft treating it like a companion instead of a threat? If it was known, then what in heaven's name was she standing beneath? Her skin burned, flushed red by the heat radiating from above. She pressed the back of her hand against her cheek and felt how hot it had become, as though she'd stood too long under a merciless sun. Yet she did not move. Awe and fury mingled in her chest. They knew, she thought. They have always known. Vickie crouched lower, shielding Colby with her body. Her prayers had softened to whispers, broken syllables carried away by the roar of rotors. She looked at the helicopters, then at Betty, her face etched with fear. "This is theirs," she said finally, her voice cracking. "They're with it." The idea sank into Betty like a stone into water. Were they escorting the craft, guiding it? Or worse, had they built it themselves, a weapon so powerful it could barely be hidden? The circle of helicopters felt too precise to be chance. They were not chasing. They were not confused. They were operating with certainty, as if everything unfolding was expected. Colby stirred, pulling back from Vickie's arms just long enough to look skyward. His young face, pale in the alternating light, carried confusion more than fear. "Why are the army guys helping it?" he asked, his small voice nearly lost in the thunder above. The question struck both women like a blow. Betty clenched her jaw, searching for an answer, but none came. How could she explain the inexplicable? How could she tell a child that the very people meant to protect them might already know the secret in the sky? The helicopters tightened formation again, moving like dark guardians around the blazing diamond. Their engines roared, but they never attacked. Not a single missile, not a single tracer round. Only silence in their weapons, noise in their engines, and obedience in their motion. For a moment, the craft seemed to hesitate, lowering slightly as if struggling with its own weight. The flames flared brighter, casting searing light across the treetops. Betty winced at the heat, shielding her face with her arm. The helicopters matched its descent perfectly, banking lower, hovering with precision, never breaking their circle. Vickie's whisper trembled. "This isn't the first time." Betty turned toward her sharply. "What do you mean?" "They came ready," Vickie said, her eyes wide, fixed on the sky. "Like they've done this before, like they knew it would be here." The thought froze them both. This was not a surprise to the military. It was an operation, one rehearsed and deliberate, unfolding above their heads without care for the witnesses standing below. The pines groaned in the heated air, their needles brittle in the furnace-like glow. Shadows stretched and snapped with each pulse of the craft's light. The highway, once a familiar road, now felt like the center of something vast and hidden, something that stretched far beyond East Texas. Betty's voice was low, filled with a quiet fury. "We'll remember this. We'll tell what we saw." Vickie looked at her, then down at Colby, his eyes wide and uncertain. She tightened her arms around him. "If they let us," she whispered. The helicopters roared on, circling, surrounding, bearing silent witness alongside the terrified family below. The sky belonged to them, but the truth of what that meant was a weight Betty and Vickie could not yet name. Chapter 4. Burning Questions. At last, the diamond in the sky began to drift away, its flames pulsing in slow, deliberate rhythm. The helicopters followed, engines thundering as they swept overhead in unison, a mechanical halo surrounding the impossible craft. The noise rolled across the pines, fading as the formation moved further down the stretch of highway. Silence crept back in, heavy and strange. The forest returned to stillness, but not to peace. The air smelled scorched, metallic, and faintly acrid. The asphalt beneath Betty's feet radiated lingering warmth. Her car ticked faintly as the metal cooled, the windshield fogging along its edges. Vickie still clutched Colby against her, whispering softly into his ear. His small body trembled, though whether from fear or the chill that followed the sudden heat, she could not tell. At last, she guided him into the car, her movements protective, mechanical. He climbed into the back seat wordlessly, curling against the upholstery with wide, searching eyes. Betty slid into the driver's seat, her skin still prickling, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. The interior of the car was hot, as though it had baked all day under a desert sun. She turned the key. The engine growled reluctantly, and the car lurched forward onto the empty road. For a while, no one spoke. The headlights carved their usual narrow tunnel through the darkness, but the world outside no longer felt familiar. Every shadow between the trees seemed deeper. Every silence seemed expectant, as though the night still held its breath. It was Colby who broke the quiet. His small voice, thin and wavering, carried forward from the back seat. "Are they gone?" "Yes, baby," Vickie murmured, though her voice was unsteady. She reached back, patting his knee with trembling fingers. "They're gone now." Betty's hands tightened on the wheel. Gone, she thought, but not forgotten. Not ever. The further they drove, the more the unease shifted into something physical. Betty felt it first, a queasy roll in her stomach, a heaviness in her chest. At first she thought it was nerves, the aftermath of shock, but the sensation sharpened quickly. A wave of nausea washed over her, forcing her to swallow hard, her throat raw. She glanced at Vickie and saw the same pallor on her friend's face. Vickie leaned forward slightly, pressing one hand to her stomach. "Something's not right," she whispered. Her skin glistened faintly with sweat, though the night air outside was cool. Colby stirred in the back seat, his small voice faint. "Grandma, I don't feel good." His words carried the tremble of a child, frightened not just by what he had seen, but by the sickness rising inside him. The car's heater, once comforting, now felt oppressive, pressing hot air into their lungs. Betty switched it off, rolling down her window, but the cool night air brought little relief. Her skin tingled, burning faintly, her arms and face flushed as though she'd been sunburned under a winter sky. The drive stretched on, every mile heavier. The pine woods that had seemed so ordinary hours earlier now loomed like silent witnesses. Betty pressed the accelerator, eager to reach home, to escape the road where the sky itself had come alive. Yet escape was impossible. The heat lingered beneath their skin, the nausea churned deeper. Even as the road carried them back towards safety, their bodies carried the mark of what they had endured. The craft was gone, the helicopters gone, but its presence remained, seared into their flesh, into their memory, into the silence of the East Texas night. The hum of the engine filled the silence as the car sped through the dark woods. Pine trees flashed past in the headlights, but Betty barely noticed them. Her stomach rolled again, a sharp cramp twisting through her belly. She gritted her teeth, willing herself to stay steady. Beside her, Vickie shifted in her seat, her hands pressed tight against her arms. "Betty," she whispered, her voice fragile. "I'm burning." She tugged at her sleeves, trying to cool herself, but her skin glistened with sweat, her face flushed. Betty flicked her eyes from the road to her friend. Red blotches had begun to spread across Vickie's cheeks and forehead, glowing faintly under the dashboard light. The sight made Betty's chest tighten. She felt the same heat crawling across her own skin, prickling. It was as though the light from the craft still clung to them, seared into their bodies. From the back seat came a small, wavering voice. "Grandma?" Colby's tone was uncertain, frightened. He sat upright now, his wide eyes catching the faint glow of the passing headlights. "What's happening to you?" Vickie twisted back toward him, forcing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "It's all right, baby," she said softly, though her voice cracked. "We'll be home soon." She reached a trembling hand over the seat, brushing his hair. Colby leaned into the touch, but the fear in his eyes deepened. Betty swallowed hard against another wave of nausea. Her throat burned as though she had breathed in smoke. She rolled the window down further, letting the cool night air rush in, but it brought no comfort. Her eyes watered, her vision blurring slightly. Still, she kept her hands tight on the wheel, forcing herself to guide the car through the empty stretches of highway. The sickness grew heavier with each mile. Betty's skin had begun to redden, blotches rising along her neck and arms. Her lips felt parched, cracked, though she had spoken only a few words. She glanced again at Vickie, whose breathing had grown shallow. "It's like radiation," Betty murmured, the word trembling on her tongue, though she had no proof. Vickie shook her head, clinging to her faith. "No, it can't be. God wouldn't allow." She stopped, her words swallowed by another cough. Her body hunched forward, as though trying to fold in on itself, to shield the boy who looked on in silent terror. Colby whimpered, his hands pressed over his ears, as though to shut out the sound of the coughing. His eyes darted from one woman to the other, too young to understand what was happening, but old enough to feel the dread pressing into the car's small cabin. "I don't like this," he said, voice breaking. "I don't like this." Betty reached one hand from the wheel, fumbling back toward him, her fingers brushing his knee. "It's all right, honey," she whispered, though the strain in her voice betrayed the lie. "We'll get you home. We'll get you safe." But she knew the truth. It wasn't just Colby who needed safety. It was all of them. Whatever light had spilled down from that craft had marked them, and now it was inside them, burning, churning, leaving traces no doctor's visit could easily erase. The highway stretched endlessly, each mile slower than the last. Betty pressed harder on the accelerator, her eyes narrowing, determined to reach town. Behind her, Colby clung to the seat, his small frame rigid with fear. Beside her, Vickie pressed her hand to her chest, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. And all the while, the invisible fire of the encounter smoldered within them, its consequences only beginning to show. By the time Betty guided the car into the quiet streets of Dayton, the nausea had sharpened into something relentless. Her skin felt raw, as if she had stood for hours under a scorching sun, though the winter air outside was cool. Vickie slumped against the passenger door, her face pale beneath the blotches of red that streaked her cheeks. Colby sat silent in the back seat, his small hands gripping the upholstery, eyes wide with worry. That night brought little relief. Betty's skin blistered, patches rising angrily across her face and arms. Vickie's eyes swelled, watering as if from smoke. Even young Colby, though less affected, complained of stomach pains and a headache that left him listless. The next morning, when Betty could barely rise from her bed, they sought medical help. The small-town clinic smelled of antiseptic and paper masks, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Nurses exchanged glances as the family shuffled in, their appearances alarming. The doctors were puzzled from the start. Betty's face was flushed with angry burns, her hair already beginning to fall out in strands that clung to her shoulders. Vickie's hands trembled as she tried to explain the night before, her voice hoarse. Colby clung to her side, looking from face to face, waiting for an answer none of the adults could provide. Tests were ordered quickly: blood work, skin samples, examinations under harsh lights. The results only deepened the confusion. The burns looked like radiation exposure, angry, blistered, inconsistent with any chemical spill or sunburn. But there had been no accident, no reactor, no known source. One physician frowned as he studied Betty's chart. "It's as though she's been irradiated," he murmured to a colleague, unaware that his words carried clearly to the women waiting nearby. Betty's eyes widened. Irradiated. The word rang through her mind, echoing with the memory of the craft's searing glow. Vickie spoke quickly, her voice desperate. "We were on the road. There was something in the sky. Fire, light, heat." Her explanation faltered under the weight of disbelief in the room. The doctors listened politely, but offered no acknowledgement. Their questions turned clinical, detached. When did the symptoms begin? Had they come into contact with pesticides, chemicals, any industrial equipment? No, Betty answered, her voice ragged. Nothing like that. It came from the sky. The physicians exchanged looks, but wrote nothing of the sort in their notes. Days passed, and their conditions worsened. Betty's burns deepened, her skin peeling in places. Clumps of hair gathered on her pillow. Her eyes ached with dryness, her vision blurred. Vickie suffered less severely, but her lips cracked, her face inflamed, her strength drained. Colby seemed to recover more quickly, though his fear lingered, quiet and constant. The doctors remained cautious, their language carefully chosen. They spoke of unexplained dermatological reactions and possible chemical exposure, never daring to commit to the truth that hovered unspoken between them. Radiation. It was the only word that fit, yet it carried with it implications no one in the room was prepared to confront. At night, Betty lay awake, her body aching, her thoughts circling the memory of the hovering diamond and the circle of helicopters. If this had been a secret test, why had they been left exposed? If it had been something unknown, why was the government silent? Each question burned as fiercely as the marks on her skin. Vickie prayed, whispering over Colby as he slept, her faith both her shield and her last fragile explanation. But even she could not dismiss the sight they had seen, the heat they had endured, and the sickness that still ravaged their bodies. For the doctors, the case remained a puzzle. For the family, it was a wound, not just of the body, but of trust. Whatever had marked them that night, it had left more than burns. It had left questions no prescription could ever heal. Chapter 5. Walls of Silence. Weeks after the encounter, the mystery weighed heavier than the burns. Betty's strength ebbed, her body marked by scars that refused to fade. Vickie managed better, though her eyes still watered, and Colby remained anxious, asking again and again if the big light in the sky would come back. But for Betty and Vickie, the greatest wound was not on their skin, it was the silence. The doctors had no answers, only cautious language and quiet speculation. Whispers of radiation exposure hung in the air, but no one would commit, and so they turned their search outward to the institutions they believed might hold the truth. Their first stop was the Air Force. The nearest base was familiar to locals, a hub of activity in the region. Betty, still weak, insisted on making the trip. She wanted to stand face to face with officials, to demand an explanation for what she and her family had endured. At the gate, soldiers in pressed uniforms listened with practiced politeness. Betty described the night in careful detail, the diamond-shaped craft, the pulsing flames, the circle of helicopters that filled the sky. Her voice cracked as she spoke of the sickness that followed, the burns, the hospital visits. Vickie added her own testimony, steady and unwavering, with Colby sitting silently at her side. The officer nodded, jotting notes, but his face betrayed nothing. When she pressed for answers, were those helicopters theirs? Was this some military test gone wrong? He shook his head gently. "We have no record of any such operation," he said. His words were clipped, rehearsed, the kind of denial that left no room for appeal. Still unsatisfied, they turned to NASA. Houston was hours away, but it represented authority, science, perhaps even compassion. If anyone could analyze what had happened, surely it would be NASA. The trip drained Betty, but she pushed forward, leaning on Vickie for strength. At the visitor desk, they explained their case again. The light, the heat, the helicopters, the sickness. Officials listened quietly, hands folded on desks, nodding at intervals. But when the time came to respond, the pattern repeated. "There's nothing we can offer you," one representative said finally, his tone sympathetic but firm. "NASA has no aircraft fitting that description, no tests in your region. We cannot explain your experience." The words landed like stones. To Betty, they sounded less like truth and more like a wall carefully built to contain it. She pressed harder, her voice trembling with anger. "You have to know, you were there. We saw them. We saw the helicopters." Again the denial. Polite, final. They left the building under the glare of the Texas sun, their bodies weary, their spirits heavy. Betty leaned against the car, her breath ragged. "They won't tell us," she said. "They'll never tell us." Vickie placed a steadying hand on her friend's arm. "Then we tell it ourselves." Her words were quiet, but resolute. She was a woman of faith, but also of conviction. If the institutions of power would not speak, then it would fall to ordinary voices to carry the truth. And so the search for accountability began. Their medical records would be gathered, photographs of their burns taken, testimony sworn. If the walls of silence stood firm, they would push against them with the only weapon they had, their story. For the first time since that night, Betty felt a spark of determination rise against the sickness. She would not be silent. She could not. The world had to know what hovered above the pines that December evening and what it had done to them. If the Air Force and NASA would not answer, then Betty and Vickie resolved to build their own case. The sickness had not vanished. Betty's skin remained raw and blistered, her hair thinning at the crown. Vickie's eyes watered constantly, her lips cracked, her hands shaking when she tried to write. Even Colby, though less harmed, still spoke often of the burning heat and the terrible light. They began collecting everything they could. Medical records were first. Betty requested copies of her hospital charts, test results, and doctor's notes. The files described her burns in clinical language: erythema, lesions, alopecia. But in the margins, some physicians had scribbled words they would not say aloud: unexplained etiology, possible radiation exposure. Each page carried weight, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary. Photographs came next. A family friend brought a camera, snapping careful pictures of Betty's reddened arms, of the angry welts across her face, of the patches where her hair had fallen away. Vickie posed reluctantly, her own swelling captured in the harsh glare of the flash. Even young Colby, pale and subdued, was photographed, though his injuries were less dramatic. His eyes told a deeper story of fear and confusion. Every image was preserved, placed in envelopes, labeled with dates. Betty insisted on order. "They'll say we imagined it," she told Vickie, her voice hard despite her weakness. "We need proof. We need everything written down." So they wrote. Long nights at Betty's kitchen table were spent recording their memories. Betty described the pulsing flames beneath the craft, the suffocating heat that left her skin raw. Vickie described the circle of helicopters, the synchronized formation that had moved like shadows bound to the light. Colby, though young, added what he remembered: the brightness, the roar, the sickness that made his stomach twist. His small handwriting joined theirs, innocent but resolute. Others were drawn in. Relatives listened and urged them to document more. Friends suggested they reach out to researchers, to newspapers. A local reporter visited, notebook in hand, listening with wide eyes as the women recounted the night. He studied their photographs, their files, their testimonies, and though cautious, he could not dismiss the evidence outright. Rumors began to spread. A story whispered in diners, murmured at gas stations. The family who had seen the diamond in the sky, the burns that no doctor could explain, the helicopters no one admitted to flying. Betty, though weary, found a spark of purpose in the work. She filed requests for more records, tracked every symptom, and kept each doctor's appointment documented. Vickie prayed over their efforts, her faith carrying her through the strain. Colby lingered nearby during these long evenings, sometimes sketching clumsy drawings of the craft, a diamond shape hovering above trees, surrounded by little ovals meant to be helicopters. His drawings joined the stack of evidence, testimony in their own way. Yet the more they gathered, the clearer their fear became. Proof might bring answers, but it might also bring consequences. If the military had circled the craft so deliberately, surely they knew. And if they knew, why had they left the family exposed? Why had they denied everything? Betty tucked the envelopes into a box she kept near her bed. Each night she touched it, reassuring herself that the story was preserved, that their suffering would not vanish into silence. She did not know what justice might look like. She only knew that without these records, without these images, the truth would die unspoken. The walls of silence remained, but now in Betty's home, in that box of papers and photographs, there was a crack, a record, a voice refusing to be erased. At first, Betty and Vickie hesitated to share their ordeal with anyone beyond friends and family. They were women of modest lives, rooted in small Texas towns. Their trust had always rested in local institutions, in doctors, in the church, in the Air Force that flew overhead. But the silence from officials left them no choice. It began quietly. A local reporter heard whispers of their encounter, a diamond-shaped craft, a sky full of helicopters, burns no doctor could explain. He arrived one afternoon, his notebook in hand, his questions cautious but persistent. Betty, still weak, guided him to her kitchen table, spreading out the stack of photographs and medical files she had collected. Vickie sat beside her, speaking calmly, her voice steady with conviction. The reporter listened, pen scratching steadily across paper. He studied the photographs with a furrowed brow, then looked directly at Betty. "You're saying the military was there?" he asked. Betty met his gaze, unwavering. "We saw them, we counted them. They filled the sky." The article appeared in the local paper a week later, tucked between community announcements and regional news. Its headline was subdued. "Careful, residents report strange object in sky." But the details caught attention. Readers lingered over the descriptions of the blazing craft, the circle of helicopters, the burns suffered by ordinary people on an ordinary drive. From there, the story spread. A regional radio station picked it up, their host speaking in hushed tones about the family in Dayton marked by fire from the sky. Then came phone calls from larger outlets, journalists curious, some skeptical, others eager. Reporters knocked on Betty's door, their cameras flashing, their voices asking the same questions again and again. The attention was overwhelming. Betty often sat pale and trembling under the lights, her voice quiet but resolute. Vickie, steady in her faith, reminded her that truth carried weight, that silence was what the powerful wanted. Colby, confused and shy, stayed mostly out of sight, his young eyes weary of strangers in suits and ties. Not all coverage was kind. Some articles hinted at exaggeration. Some radio hosts chuckled, dismissing the women as confused or hysterical. But the photographs of Betty's burns silenced the harshest critics. The images were undeniable: blistered skin, hair fallen away, eyes swollen and red. These were not the marks of imagination. Soon the case drew the attention of researchers beyond Texas. UFO investigators contacted the family, requesting interviews, examining the evidence. They treated Betty and Vickie with respect, listening carefully, comparing their testimony with other accounts across the country. One researcher murmured after hearing the details, "It fits the pattern." His words offered little comfort, but they confirmed something the women already sensed. They were not alone in this. National outlets followed, their headlines bolder. Texas family claims contact with unknown craft. Mysterious illness follows UFO encounter. The story traveled far beyond East Texas, carried into living rooms across America. With each retelling, the details became part of something larger, a growing body of accounts that suggested the skies held secrets not yet confessed. Betty, despite her suffering, pressed forward. Each time she told the story, she felt both drained and strengthened. "We didn't ask for this," she told one reporter firmly, "but it happened, and will not be silent." Vickie sat close by, Colby's hand in hers, her faith steady, even as the weight of attention bore down. She believed the truth was meant to be spoken, even if the world doubted. The walls of silence had not fallen. Officials still denied, still deflected, but the cracks were spreading. From a small Texas highway, the story had moved outward, carried by newspapers, radios, and televisions, until it became too large to ignore. And yet, with the attention came a heavier burden. What had once been their private ordeal was now a public mystery, one that the world demanded answers for, and one the government refused to explain. Chapter 6: Echoes Through Time. By the mid-1980s, the Landrum case had become more than a whispered story of a strange light in the woods. It was documented in files, preserved in photographs, carried in the voices of Betty and Vickie. The burns remained, the sickness lingered, and still, the silence from the government weighed heavier than the scars themselves. Betty, never one to shrink from a fight, began to push harder. If the Air Force denied, if NASA deflected, then the courts might force answers. With the help of lawyers and sympathetic researchers, she and Vickie filed a lawsuit against the United States government, seeking compensation for the injuries they believed had been caused by a secret military craft. The case was extraordinary. Rarely had ordinary citizens dared to challenge the government over something so mysterious, so controversial. Yet Betty and Vickie believed the evidence was strong. Their medical records, their testimony, Colby's account, and the undeniable presence of military helicopters on that December night. Court filings described the encounter in stark detail: the diamond-shaped craft, the pulsing flames, the unbearable heat that left them burned, the sky full of helicopters that seemed to act in coordination. The documents argued that the government either owned the craft or knew what it was and had failed to protect civilians from its effects. For Betty, the lawsuit was about more than money. It was about accountability. Each time she sat in a lawyer's office, her voice hoarse but determined, she repeated the same words: "They left us to burn. They can't be allowed to pretend it never happened." The case drew headlines, though not always sympathetic ones. Some reporters treated it as a curiosity, another UFO lawsuit to amuse late-night audiences. Others took it seriously, noting the gravity of women scarred and weakened, seeking justice from the most powerful institution in the country. Months turned into years. The legal process was slow, grinding, heavy with paperwork and hearings. Betty's health worsened with each passing season. Her hospital stays grew longer, her body weaker. Vickie, though in better shape, carried the strain of caring for Colby while standing firm in the fight. When the case finally came before the courts, the government responded with precision. Lawyers argued that no evidence tied any U.S. military program to the craft described. They claimed the helicopters were coincidental, that no official records confirmed their presence that night. They dismissed the medical records as inconclusive, suggesting the burns could have come from other causes. The courtroom became another wall of silence, built not from denials at a gatehouse or clipped replies in an office, but from polished legal arguments that erased responsibility. In the end, the lawsuit was dismissed. No compensation, no acknowledgement, just a ruling that left Betty and Vickie standing outside the courthouse with nothing but the truth they carried in their own bodies. For Betty, it was a bitter blow. She had endured pain, ridicule, and the long wait of waiting, only to be told, once again, that what she had lived through did not exist in the eyes of power. Yet the dismissal did not erase the case. Instead, it made it larger. Researchers wrote of it. Advocates pointed to it as proof of government denial. Each page of testimony, each medical record submitted, became part of a growing archive that others would study for decades. Betty and Vickie had not won their fight, but in bringing it to court, they ensured the story could never be forgotten. The lawsuit may have been dismissed, but the echo of it still lingers, a reminder of what happens when ordinary citizens collide with extraordinary truths and the silence of institutions too large to admit them. Betty and Vickie were not the only ones to remember that winter night. In the weeks and months that followed, scattered accounts began to surface from across East Texas. People who had once kept silent, afraid of ridicule, uncertain of what they had seen, now found their courage when they read of the Cash Landrum case in newspapers or heard it whispered in cafes and barber shops. Suddenly, their strange experiences no longer seemed so isolated. A truck driver came forward first. He had been driving a late-night haul along a rural stretch near Huffman, just miles from where Betty had stopped her car. He recalled seeing lights through the trees, so bright they forced him to slow his rig. At first, he thought it was a fire, maybe a gas flare gone wrong. But then he saw helicopters, too many to count, sweeping low in the sky. He didn't see the craft itself, but the light and the thunder of rotors haunted him long after. Another witness, a woman in Cleveland, Texas, remembered stepping onto her porch that same evening. She had seen a glow beyond the pines, rising and falling, pulsing against the horizon like distant lightning. Yet there were no storms, no thunderclouds, only the eerie glow and the unmistakable sound of helicopters rattling her windows. She told no one at the time, but when the news broke, she quietly admitted that the night had unsettled her deeply. Even a police officer, speaking off the record, hinted that his department had received calls of strange lights and too many helicopters on the night of December 29th. The calls had been noted but filed away, dismissed as confusion, but in hindsight, the pattern was undeniable. The testimonies multiplied. Farmers, hunters, night workers. Some had seen the glow. Others had heard the thrum of rotors that shook the stillness of the woods. A few claimed glimpses of the craft itself, diamond-shaped, massive, slow-moving, though always from a distance, always shrouded by trees or horizon. Investigators documented these accounts carefully, adding them to the growing archive of the Cash Landrum Incident. Each testimony, however small, added weight. It was not just three people on a lonely road. Something larger had moved across the skies that night, and it had not gone unseen. For Betty, hearing of these witnesses was both a comfort and a sorrow. Comfort, because it meant she and her family were not alone. Others had glimpsed the same impossible event. sorrow, because so many had stayed silent when their voices were most needed. She wondered, sometimes, if more testimony early on might have forced the government to act differently. Vickie saw the witnesses as validation. "The Lord gave us others to stand with us," she said one evening, her hands folded over her Bible. She believed truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how many walls of silence were built around it. But the pattern of testimony also deepened the unease. For every person who spoke, there were likely others who remained quiet, unwilling to risk scorn or suspicion. And for every account that surfaced, there was still the lingering absence of official acknowledgement. The helicopters became the most consistent thread. Almost every independent witness spoke of them. The roar, the numbers, the precision. It was impossible to dismiss as imagination. No one mistook a sky full of military machines, yet the Air Force denied any record, any operation, any flights at all. The contradiction gnawed at researchers. Either the helicopters belonged to the United States military, or they did not. If they did, then the denials were deliberate. If they did not, then the mystery was even darker. Betty, listening to these contradictions, felt her resolve strengthen. "They can say what they want," she told one interviewer, her voice raspy but steady. "But we weren't the only ones. Too many people saw, too many people heard. You can't cover up the sound of the sky shaking." And indeed, the echoes of that night continued to ripple. Each new witness added another layer, another confirmation that the Vickie Landrum case was no isolated tale. It was a shared experience, scattered across the woods and highways of Texas, remembered in fragments, but undeniable in its whole. The truth, it seemed, was larger than three voices. It was a chorus, faint but growing, against the silence of authority. As the years passed, most UFO sightings faded quickly into rumor or folklore. A light in the sky, a story whispered at a diner, a photograph tucked into a drawer. But the Vickie Landrum incident did not fade. It grew. Researchers returned to it again and again, drawn by its rare combination of elements: multiple witnesses, severe physical effects, corroborating accounts of helicopters, and the complete silence of official channels. It was, in the words of one investigator, the closest thing to a smoking gun that civilian UFO research has ever seen. The medical evidence stood out most sharply. Unlike many encounters that left only memory, this one left burns, scars, and hospital records. Betty's skin carried the mark of that night for the rest of her life. Doctors testified to her condition, noting symptoms consistent with radiation exposure, even if they could not name the source. Vickie's swelling, Colby's illness, all of it remained written in clinical notes that could not be dismissed as fantasy. The helicopters, too, became an anchor for the case. Other sightings often involved lights or shapes that might be mistaken for stars, planets, or aircraft. But a sky filled with dozens of helicopters, that was no trick of the imagination. Too many witnesses described the same thunder of rotors, the same synchronized formation. Whatever the diamond-shaped craft was, it had not moved alone. Books began to cite the case. Conferences featured it as a centerpiece, debated in panel after panel. Some argued it was proof of experimental military technology, perhaps nuclear-powered aircraft being tested in secret. Others insisted it was something far stranger, a craft of non-human origin, observed and escorted by human machines. Each theory carried flaws, but none erased the weight of the testimony. Skeptics tried to dismantle the story. They pointed to inconsistencies in timing, to the lack of direct photographs, to the government's denials. They suggested the burns might have come from other sources, industrial chemicals, household accidents, but each counter-argument faltered against the sheer persistence of Betty and Vickie's voices. They did not seek fame. They did not profit. They endured ridicule, sickness, and endless questions, yet their story never wavered. Betty, though weakened by illness, continued to speak publicly. Her voice, raspy with age and pain, still carried conviction. "I know what I saw," she repeated again and again. Vickie, quieter but equally firm, echoed her. "We were there. The Lord knows the truth, and so do we." Colby, as he grew older, spoke less often, but in interviews as a man, he confirmed what he had witnessed as a child. The heat, the helicopters, his grandmother's fear. For him, the memory was not a curiosity. It was the night his childhood changed forever. Researchers cataloged the case into archives. The Mutual UFO Network, the Center for UFO Studies, and independent investigators all filed reports. Each added layers of documentation, transcripts of interviews, copies of hospital records, sketches of the craft. The case became a foundation stone in modern UFO history, referenced whenever officials dismissed sightings as unreliable. Even within government circles, whispers persisted. Declassified documents later showed that intelligence officials had indeed reviewed the case, though no conclusions were released. The contradictions only deepened the mystery. If the event was meaningless, why had it been studied at all? If it was significant, why had it been buried? Decades later, the story continues to echo. Television documentaries replay Betty's words. Podcasts revisit the night in hushed tones. Scholars debate whether the helicopters prove a classified program or a clandestine observation of something unearthly. Each generation rediscovers the story, finding in it the same unresolved tension, a blend of human suffering and official silence. The Landrum Incident became more than just an encounter. It became a question carved into history, one that refuses to be erased. On that cold Texas night, 3 lives changed forever, but the ripples spread outward, touching researchers, skeptics, believers, and officials alike. It remains, even now, a reminder that some events are too large to be silenced, too enduring to be dismissed. Chapter 7. The Human Cost. The years following the encounter were not kind to Betty Cash. In the first weeks after the night on the Texas highway, she tried to carry on as best she could, moving between doctor's appointments, church visits, and the routines of daily life. But her body would not let her forget. The burns that had first blistered across her skin never fully healed. They scarred, left patches of red and white across her face and arms, reminders etched into her flesh. Her hair, once thick and dark, began to fall away in clumps, first on her pillow, then in the shower drain, until the patches were too visible to hide. Wigs became a necessity, though Betty wore them with quiet dignity. What troubled her more than appearance was the weakness that crept into her bones. Fatigue dogged her steps. Some days she could not rise from bed without help. Doctors tried to explain, but their language remained vague. Dermatological complications, immune system dysfunction, possible radiation-like exposure. Tests showed abnormalities, but offered no cure. Treatments eased symptoms only briefly. Each hospital visit ended with more questions than answers. The medical bills piled high. Friends and family helped where they could, but the weight of the expenses added to the suffering. Betty's lawsuit against the government had been dismissed, and with it any chance of official assistance. She bore the costs herself, her savings dwindling as her health declined. Despite it all, she remained outspoken. When researchers called, she answered. When journalists asked, she told the story again, even as her voice grew weaker. She believed the truth had to be preserved, that silence would be a betrayal not only of herself, but of every witness whose account had been doubted. Her home became a quiet archive of pain and persistence. Folders of medical records stacked neatly in drawers, boxes of photographs capturing her burns in their worst moments, letters from researchers, from sympathizers, even from skeptics. She kept them all. Each page was proof, each word a barrier against being forgotten. But the toll was heavy. Nights were restless. Pain woke her often, forcing her to pace slowly through darkened rooms, her body aching under scars that never softened. Friends noticed the change in her. She laughed less. Her eyes, once lively, carried the weary glaze of someone who had seen too much and carried too much. Yet when she spoke of that night, her conviction never faltered. "I know what I saw," she told one interviewer, her hands trembling in her lap. "I know what it did to me, and I know they'll never admit it, but I won't stop saying it." Hospitalizations became more frequent as the years went on. Doctors treated infections, mysterious sores, even bouts of hair loss that returned in cycles. Betty's body seemed to fight battles it had never been meant to fight, as though the heat from that craft had rewritten something deep inside her. Those who loved her admired her resolve, but they also saw the cost. Each public telling of the story drained her. Each journey to a conference or interview left her weaker. But still she went, still she spoke, still she stood as a living reminder of the night when silence and fire descended on a Texas road. For Betty, the cost of that night was not just in scars or sickness, it was in time. Years of life lived under the shadow of pain, years of asking questions that no official would answer. Yet she carried it with a stubborn dignity, her story, her shield, her voice, her weapon, even as her body betrayed her. Her life, once ordinary, had been reshaped by a single night, and though it was slowly consumed by the consequences, she never let the world forget what had happened. While Betty bore the heaviest physical scars, Vickie Landrum carried her own burden, one that weighed more on her heart than her body. Her injuries had been less severe. The burns that marked her skin eventually faded, and her strength returned more fully than Betty's. But the memory of the night never left her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the blaze above the pines, the circle of helicopters, the small body of her grandson trembling in her arms. For Vickie, the ordeal became a test of faith. She had always been devout, her Bible well worn, her prayers steady. That night in the woods, she had clutched Colby close and whispered scripture against the roar of rotors, believing the words themselves might shield him. In the weeks after, when his small voice asked again and again what had happened, she leaned on that same faith. God was with us, she told him, her voice steady though her own questions pressed deep. We were spared because he watched over us. It was not an explanation that satisfied Betty, who bristled at the silence of officials and demanded accountability, but for Vickie, it was the only way to steady her grandson's spirit. She could not tell him that the world had left them unprotected, that even the government had turned its face away. So she told him that heaven had carried them through, even as the fire burned. Colby grew up with the story stitched into his childhood. He remembered the heat, the noise, the trembling in his grandmother's arms. He remembered the sickness that made him curl in bed for days afterward, watching as Betty and Vickie grew weaker around him. But more than the memory of fear, He remembered the constant presence of Vickie's voice, soothing, praying, telling him again and again that he was safe, that they had survived because they were meant to. At school, he learned quickly not to share what he had seen. Children teased, teachers frowned. When the newspapers picked up the story, some neighbors whispered that it was exaggerated, others that it was a hoax. Colby, young and tender, felt the sting of doubt more than anyone. Yet Vickie stood by him. "You saw it," she told him firmly. "You don't need to convince anyone. The Lord knows the truth, and so do we." Her faith became a shield not only for herself, but for him. Each time she prayed, it was for his strength, for his future. She told him that one day the world would understand, even if they never admitted it now. Vickie herself lived with quieter scars. At night, when she looked out across the dark pines, she sometimes caught herself flinching at distant lights. Helicopters overhead still made her tense, her arms instinctively reaching for Colby, even after he had grown too tall to cling to her side. And though her body had healed more than Betty's, she never forgot the sting of those early burns, the days when her lips cracked and her skin blistered. She knew what she had endured, even if officials denied it. What separated her from Betty was not doubt, but approach. Betty fought with fire, demanding answers from men in uniforms, from courtrooms, from microphones. Vickie fought with quiet endurance, her strength rooted in scripture, her resolve in the steady rhythm of faith. Together they formed two halves of the same whole. Betty the voice, Vickie the anchor. Between them, the story endured, and through it all Colby grew, shaped by both the trauma of that night and the resilience of the women who raised him. He would later say that the night stole something from his childhood, that no 7-year-old should see the sky filled with fire and helicopters. But he would also say that his grandmother's faith carried him through, giving him the strength to live with the questions that never found answers. In the end, Vickie's role was not just to survive the encounter, but to make sure her grandson could survive the memory of it. And in that task, her faith never wavered. Telling the story was often harder than living it. Betty and Vickie discovered this each time they sat across from a reporter, a researcher, or a stranger, curious about the night with the UFO. At first, there was relief in speaking, in knowing their voices carried the truth into the world. But as the years wore on, the questions shifted. They were no longer about what happened, but about whether it could possibly be true. Skeptics picked at the details. How many helicopters? Exactly what shape was the craft? Were they sure it wasn't a plane, a flare, an industrial accident? The questions fell like cold rain, wearing down patience, forcing the women to repeat themselves over and over. Betty bristled at the doubt. "We lived it," she would say, her voice sharp with pain and exhaustion. "No one can tell me what I saw. No one." Vickie met the doubt with quieter resolve. She spoke gently, her words steady, but her eyes held the same unshakable certainty. "We were there," she reminded anyone who asked. "We carried the burns. That is all the proof I need." Yet even in their certainty, the weight of disbelief pressed heavily. Friends sometimes avoided the topic, neighbors whispered, and church members looked away when the subject arose. To live with the memory of the craft was one thing. To live with the knowledge that others dismissed it was another. For Colby, growing up in the long shadow of the encounter, doubt was more cutting than the memory itself. Children teased him when the case appeared on television. Teachers treated his story as a curiosity at best, a fabrication at worst. "That's the boy who saw the UFO," they would whisper. The label clung to him, shaping his sense of self. At home, Vickie shielded him as best she could, reminding him that truth was not measured by acceptance. People doubted Noah too, she told him once, her voice steady as she read from the pages of her Bible. But the truth does not disappear because someone laughs. Betty, though, felt the sting of public doubt, like a wound that never healed. She carried her burns openly, her hospital records carefully filed, her scars visible. Yet still, officials shrugged, journalists smirked, skeptics dismissed. Each denial deepened her conviction, but also her sorrow. "It's not just what we went through," she told a researcher one evening. "It's living every day with people acting like it never happened, like you're crazy, like you made it all up." She tapped the scars on her arms, her voice trembling with both anger and fatigue. These didn't come from nothing. The story's persistence in UFO circles did little to ease the burden. Yes, researchers cataloged it. Yes, it became a centerpiece at conferences, a case study in government denial and unexplained encounters. But the very fact that it was studied under the banner of UFOs carried its own stigma. For some, the word itself meant fantasy, fringe, the unbelievable. And yet, the story never vanished. The testimony never shifted. The medical evidence remained. Decades later, the Landrum Incident still held its place in the annals of mystery, still cited, still debated. That in itself was a victory of sorts. For Betty, the cost was measured in pain and in silence. For Vickie, it was in the burden of carrying faith alongside memory. For Colby, it was in a childhood reshaped by fear and ridicule. The truth of that night remained locked in their bodies, in their scars, in their memories. And though the world might doubt, though the government might deny, the fact of their suffering was undeniable. Carrying a story doubted but never disproven is its own kind of exile. Yet for Betty, Vickie, and Colby, it also became a calling. They were witnesses, unwilling and unprepared, but witnesses all the same. And in their refusal to forget, the truth survived, scarred, silenced, but unbroken. The road is quiet again now. The headlights are gone. The helicopters are gone. The pulsing diamond of fire has long since vanished into memory. Only the pine woods remain, stretching tall and still across East Texas, their branches whispering faintly in the night air. It has been decades since that December evening in 1980. The questions asked then are still asked now. What was the craft? Why did the helicopters circle it so precisely? Why were Betty, Vickie, and young Colby left to suffer in silence while officials denied and dismissed? There are no final answers. The files remain closed. The reports remain inconclusive. The silence, like the forest, endures. But the story itself has not faded. It lingers in whispers, in research notes, in books and documentaries. It echoes in conference halls where investigators still debate, in living rooms where families still watch and wonder, in quiet moments when someone steps outside at night, looks up at the stars, and remembers. For Betty, the cost was written in scars that never healed. For Vickie, it was a test of faith, a lifelong reminder that her prayers had been whispered under the roar of machines no one admitted existed. For Colby, it was a childhood marked by fear, by doubt, by the knowledge that he had seen something no child should have to carry. And yet, they endured. The Landrum Incident stands now as one of the most haunting mysteries in modern history, not only for what was seen in the skies, but for what followed, the sickness, the silence, the denial. It is a story that reminds us of the human cost of encountering the unknown and the heavy burden of carrying truth when the world does not want to hear it. But as you lie here tonight, eyes closed, breath slowing, let the story soften into something gentler. Picture the East Texas highway, stretching long and quiet beneath the stars. Imagine the headlights of a lone car carving through the dark, its beams steady against the endless night. The pine trees sway softly in the cool air. The scent of resin drifts faintly on the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a farmhouse window glows with the last of its Christmas lights, a reminder of ordinary life untouched by mystery. The helicopters are gone. The craft is gone. What remains is the silence, deep, steady, eternal. You may feel the weight of the questions still lingering, but let them drift away for now. Not every story needs an answer tonight. Some are simply here to remind us of wonder, of awe, of the vastness above us. The skies have always held mysteries, and perhaps they always will. Let the rhythm of the night steady you, the soft hum of memory, the slow hush of the forest, the quiet stretch of road disappearing into darkness. Breathe in, breathe out. Imagine the stars overhead, sharp and bright against the black canvas of the sky. Imagine the peace of knowing that whatever secrets they hold, they will wait. They will always wait. The Vickie Landrum Incident is not just a story of fire in the sky. It is a story of resilience, of courage, of ordinary people who stood beneath the extraordinary and endured. Their voices still echo, not to frighten, not to disturb, but to remind us that mystery is part of being human. And tonight, that mystery can be your companion into rest. The highway is empty now, stretching into the stillness. The headlights fade. The pines stand tall and unmoving. Above them, the stars shine quietly, eternal and indifferent, guiding you gently into sleep. Rest now. Let the questions fall silent. Let the forest cradle you in its quiet. The night belongs to peace once more, and in that peace you drift,